That night, the sky above Novigrad stopped belonging to its masters. It wasn't thunder that tore the silence, it was the sound of hundreds of mechanical wings slicing through the darkness, carrying with them the collapse of an empire that once believed itself invincible. For the first time in modern history, the capital of a superpower, the heart of control, the symbol of absolute authority, was no longer safe. At exactly 11:47 p.m., radar screens across the defense grid exploded into chaos. Dots multiplied faster than any algorithm could count. At first, commanders thought it was a malfunction. Seconds later, alarms began to scream in unison. The sky was filled with moving shadows, small, fast, relentless. They didn't come in formation. They came like a storm with no pattern, no mercy, no hesitation. And in that storm, the illusion of control disintegrated. For years, the government had promised its people that the capital was untouchable, that no enemy could ever pierce its air defenses. The city had been turned into a fortress of pride, protected by layers of radar, interceptors, and electromagnetic barriers that cost more than the hospitals, schools, and farms combined. They said it was the most secure place on Earth. That night, every promise burned. The first drones broke through the outer perimeter within minutes. They didn't need precision, they only needed presence. The roar of engines was replaced by the eerie hum of automation, a sound that carried more terror than any explosion. People stepped out onto balconies, recording lights darting across the sky like swarms of glowing insects. What they didn't know was that those insects were rewriting the story of power. Inside the control center, confusion turned into disbelief. Orders were shouted, denied, rewritten, and repeated. The system, designed to predict every threat, suddenly faced something it had never seen before. Hundreds of threats that could not be predicted, tracked, or stopped. Algorithms froze. Officers hesitated. Decisions fractured. In the command chain, fear spread faster than electricity. At midnight, a voice from the central network tried to calm the nation. Our defense is fully operational. But outside, the truth was visible to every eye that dared to look up. Fire streaked across the horizon. Explosions flickered like dying stars above the skyline. The hum of drones became the soundtrack of a reality no propaganda could silence. In less than 30 minutes, air supremacy, the Empire's greatest pride, was gone. The billions spent on defense couldn't protect the airspace for even an hour. The city that once ruled others from above was now trapped under its own sky. And as the night deepened, it became clear that this was not just a military failure, it was the collapse of an idea. The attack was not designed to destroy buildings. It was designed to destroy confidence. Each drone that crossed the border was a message carved into the air. You are not untouchable. The system that claimed perfection could not even locate its enemy. The commanders watching the monitors were not fighting machines, they were fighting disbelief. Across Novigrad, the contrast was brutal. Government networks insisted everything was under control, while social feeds filled with images of fire, alarms, and streaks of light. Citizens, who had been taught to believe in absolute safety, felt something far worse than fear. They felt betrayal. For the first time, they realized that the Empire's promises were fragile, that its shields were illusions, and that no fortress, however mighty, can stand against the truth of its own weakness. By 2 a.m., the drones began to fade from radar. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was the silence of a nation that had just witnessed the end of its own myth. A myth built on control, wealth, and fear, now shattered by precision, intelligence, and audacity. When dawn approached, the capital still stood, but its heart had cracked. There were no parades, no speeches, no celebrations, only questions no one dared to answer. The world had seen what happened, and the message was clear. The era of invincible powers had ended. The sky, once a symbol of dominance, had become the stage of their defeat. And above the quiet city, where the smoke of the night still lingered, a new truth took flight, one that no army could shoot down. The morning after the attack, the man who once ruled the sky couldn't look out his window. Viktor Orlov, the Chancellor of the Federation, the face of a power that promised immortality, sat in silence as the echoes of the previous night refused to fade. The city was still standing, but something within it, something within him had already collapsed. Fear had reached the throne. For years, he had been the symbol of control. Every broadcast, every parade, every speech was carefully orchestrated to remind the world that he was untouchable. He had declared that no weapon on earth could reach his capital. He had laughed at those who doubted him. And yet now, the man who once smiled before cameras was watching his soldiers mount machine guns on the backs of old civilian trucks, Chinese-made pickups parked at the edge of the Kremlin district, just meters away from the palace gates. That image was not strength. It was surrender disguised as readiness. It was the moment when the empire of pride showed its human weakness. For the first time, Viktor's power depended not on missiles or command centers, but on improvised defenses, manned by soldiers who no longer believed in victory. They stood where tourists once took photos, clutching cold metal, their eyes scanning a sky that no longer obeyed them. Just days before, Viktor had boasted about a new intercontinental missile with a range of over 14,000 kilometers. He called it unstoppable, a weapon to silence the West, to terrify the world, to prove that his nation still ruled the balance of fear. But fear had changed sides. The night sky of Novagrad had reversed it. Now it was he who feared what he could not stop. Behind closed doors, he ordered an emergency redeployment of defenses. He stripped his own country bare to protect the capital. 400 seconds were dismantled from the coasts. 300 seconds withdrawn from borders. Panzer batteries relocated from front lines where soldiers still fought and died. Entire regions were left exposed so that the city of power could breathe behind a wall of iron. It was a desperate move, an act not of strategy but of survival. Advisors told him the transfer would leave critical bases vulnerable. He didn't care. The capital had to be secured. His mind was no longer on the war, it was on his own safety. The world thought Viktor was fighting for his country. The truth was, he was fighting for himself. Every weapon moved to Novagrad was a confession that fear had already won. By noon, convoys began to roll through the highways, columns of trucks carrying missile launchers, radars, and electronic jammers. The citizens watching from balconies didn't cheer. They watched in silence, realizing that these were not reinforcements arriving to protect them, but evidence of how fragile their protection truly was. The order spread like wildfire through the defense ministry: dismantle, transport, reassemble. Even the distant submarine bases in the Far East were told to send their systems. It was madness, but no one dared to oppose it. To question Viktor now was to question the myth that had held the empire together. And when myths begin to break, silence becomes survival. Every kilometer of highway that carried those machines was another wound opened in the body of the nation. Whole divisions lost their air cover. Border towns were left exposed. Commanders stared at empty radars, knowing that if an attack came tomorrow, they would have nothing to stop it. But the order was absolute. Protect the capital, protect the symbol, protect the illusion. And so, Moscow, renamed in his era as Novagrad, the city of the future, became a fortress built on the bones of its own defenses. Every missile launcher positioned near the Kremlin was a monument to his fear. Every radar turned toward the horizon was a silent admission that the empire was no longer defending its people. It was defending its ruler. When state television broadcast the images of the redeployment, the anchors spoke with pride, calling it a new phase of strategic readiness. But anyone who looked closely could see the truth in Viktor's eyes when he appeared on screen. His confidence had cracks. His words trembled. He spoke of control, yet his voice betrayed panic. The man who had once intimidated nations now looked like a prisoner guarded by his own army. That morning, the city's skyline shimmered with weapons. S-400 launchers in public parks, Panzer turrets on rooftops, soldiers guarding intersections that once led to museums and theaters. It was no longer a capital, it was a cage. The citizens walked beneath a canopy of steel meant to protect them, unaware that it was also the symbol of their confinement. And somewhere deep inside his palace, Viktor Orlov finally understood what the world would soon see. That power built on fear will always come to fear itself. They called it Operation Fortress Novagrad, a project born not from confidence, but from the trembling hands of fear. What began as a defense plan soon turned into the greatest transfer of power and paranoia in the nation's history. It wasn't strategy anymore, it was obsession. In the months that followed the first drone incursions, Viktor Orlov demanded that the capital be transformed into an unbreachable citadel. His order was simple, absolute, and irreversible.
The red blip
Nothing reaches Novagrad. From that moment, every corner of the country began to bleed resources toward the center. Satellite images would later reveal the truth, an empire consuming itself to protect one man's fear. Convoys stretched across the highways like metallic veins, pumping life from the distant edges of the nation toward the beating heart of power. From Kaliningrad's mist-covered coastlines to the frozen submarine bases of the Far East, every region watched its defenses stripped bare. 400 seconds were dismantled under the grey sky, radars dismounted from their towers, and anti-air batteries torn from the soil they were meant to defend. Engineers worked day and night under secret orders. Every truck that left a base was another promise broken to the soldiers who remained behind, exposed to the sky. The military called it a strategic reallocation. The truth was far simpler. It was fear, systematized. Fear with a budget, fear with blueprints and authorization codes. In just 60 days, entire defense grids disappeared from the borderlands and reappeared around the capital. The once quiet forests and suburban districts of Novagrad began to fill with the silhouettes of missile launchers and radar domes. 21 new defense zones were carved into the city's map. Industrial parks, empty lots, and even public gardens were converted into launch platforms. S-400 towers rose behind apartment blocks. Pantsir systems were hidden beneath the mirrored glass of corporate rooftops. The skyline of Novagrad, once a symbol of prosperity, now looked like a city holding its breath under invisible crosshairs. Citizens noticed. They always do. But no one dared to ask. Trucks came at night, guarded by unmarked soldiers, followed by engineers who spoke to no one. The morning after, new fences appeared where playgrounds once stood. A curtain of secrecy wrapped itself around the capital. The government called it routine maintenance. The people called it what it was, preparation for a war that had already begun. Inside the Ministry of Defense, arguments broke out. Field commanders pleaded not to dismantle critical systems from the border. Analysts warned that removing air defenses from strategic regions would leave entire provinces naked to attack. Viktor refused to listen. Logic had become the enemy. Fortress Novagrad had become his sanctuary and his sentence. Every piece of equipment moved to protect the capital was another stone added to his cage. The paranoia spread through the ranks like a contagion. Officers began to compete in loyalty, offering more systems, more manpower, more territory to feed the fortress. Fear of being labeled disloyal outweighed the fear of losing the country's outer defenses. The result was a hollow empire, its strength drained from the edges, its might concentrated in one trembling core. By October, intelligence networks from abroad had already mapped the pattern. Open-source satellite data exposed what the government refused to admit. Analysts could trace the exact locations where systems had been removed. Kaliningrad, once shielded against NATO. Border towns near Ukraine, where soldiers now watched the sky with nothing but rifles. Submarine bases in the Pacific, left vulnerable to the very waters they once ruled. Every transfer was a confession of weakness, visible to the world. The domestic propaganda machine worked overtime, producing headlines about restructuring for efficiency. But even state television couldn't mask the absurdity. Parks surrounded by barbed wire, apartment roofs turned into anti-air nests, citizens living beside missile silos disguised as warehouses. The capital had turned itself into a museum of fear, every exhibit paid for with another region's safety. And at the center of it all, Viktor Orlov watched the progress reports, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who mistook panic for control. He believed the fortress would make him untouchable, but those who studied the maps knew better. They saw what he couldn't see, that by concentrating his defenses in one place, he had left the rest of the nation vulnerable, wide open, undefended. The empire was now a body protecting only its heart while letting its limbs decay. It was a castle built not on strength, but on isolation. Every missile, every radar, every soldier surrounding Novagrad was proof of how deeply fear had taken root. The capital was now the safest city in the world, and the weakest at the same time. The world would soon learn the price of that choice. For now, the fortress stood silent, proud, and blind to the storm it had invited. It began again, like a nightmare replaying itself. The night of October 26th, the sky over Novagrad ignited not with light, but with fear. The fortress that had taken months to build, billions to fund, and endless propaganda to glorify, met its first true test. Within minutes, it began to crumble. The enemy did not send jets, missiles, or armies. They sent silence wrapped in wings. Hundreds of drones, invisible to radar, unstoppable in number, flooded the sky like a swarm born from the darkness itself. The most defended capital on Earth was about to face the truth it had tried to bury. Fear cannot protect you. At 10:07 p.m., the first alert came. It was dismissed as a false alarm. 2 minutes later, 10 more alarms followed, then 50, then chaos. The control network overloaded. Monitors flickered red. The commanders at the defense center watched in disbelief as their billion-dollar systems failed to track the incoming wave. The algorithms froze, the interceptors stalled, the radar screens bled static. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The drones came from all directions, north, south, east, west, each one carrying only a small charge, but together they were a storm of confusion. They moved too low for satellites, too fast for interceptors, too many for logic. The sound of the first explosions rippled through the outskirts like thunder rolling through a hollow chest. By the time the defenses reacted, the sky had already been breached. The myth of Fortress Novagrad had lasted less than 1 hour. Inside the capital, panic was instant and total. Airports went dark. Domodedov, Sheremetov, Vnukovo, all closed in minutes. Thousands of passengers were stranded in terminals filled with silence and screens that displayed nothing but delay. The airspace of a superpower had just been shut down by machines no larger than a suitcase. Cargo flights were grounded, communications jammed, and the city's arteries, its runways and railways froze in fear. The government released its first statement at midnight, all threats neutralized. But the windows of Novagrad told another story. Fire bloomed in the distance like a wound opening in the skyline. A fuel depot near Kaluga burned for hours, its flames clawing at the night. Explosions echoed in Podolsk, Dubna, and Troitsk. Black smoke drifted above the suburbs like a banner of truth the regime couldn't tear down. And amid that darkness, people saw what no propaganda could erase: flashes of anti-air fire, streaks of tracer rounds, and the trembling hands of soldiers firing blindly into the void. For the first time, the citizens saw fear on the faces of those who once claimed invincibility. The same soldiers who had paraded in golden uniforms now crouched behind pickup trucks, aiming at shadows. The same leaders who once boasted of unstoppable missiles now hid behind silence. And above them all, the drones kept coming unmanned, unstoppable, unafraid. The capital's defenses, the pride of a nation, cracked under the simplest truth of warfare: no fortress can stop the sky. Billions had been poured into the dream of protection, yet in those hours, money meant nothing. The city's most advanced systems were helpless against the storm. The fortress that had consumed the nation's strength now revealed itself as hollow, a monument to fear pretending to be faith. Every explosion brought with it not just fire, but revelation. For the people of Novagrad, the illusion shattered with every tremor that passed through their walls. They had believed the promises, repeated the slogans, trusted the shield. Now they understood. The shield was paper, and the hand holding it was shaking. At 2:30 a.m., the Defense Ministry claimed victory again. 193 drones destroyed. The number was meant to sound powerful. Instead, it revealed the scale of their helplessness. If 193 were destroyed, how many had slipped through? How many had reached the heart of the city? How many truths could they hide when the entire sky was witness? By dawn, the attack was over. The silence returned, but it was not peace. It was the sound of disbelief. The fortress still stood, but its spirit was broken. The streets were filled with the hum of generators, the flicker of emergency lights, the distant echo of unanswered questions. The city had survived, but its fate had not. That night changed everything. It marked the moment when the myth of control met the weight of reality and lost. The capital that had devoured its nation's defenses to protect itself had proven that no wall of steel, no net of radar, no fortress of fear could save a regime from its own truth. The strongest city in the world had been brought to its knees by the simplest weapon of all, a reminder that power without wisdom is only the illusion of safety. It was not chaos, it was choreography. Every drone that crossed into the Empire's airspace that night moved with purpose, precision, and quiet intelligence. What looked like disorder was, in fact, the most calculated assault of the modern age. A storm designed not to destroy, but to overwhelm. Ukraine's engineers had rewritten the rulebook of war, turning simplicity into strategy, and turning the Empire's arrogance against itself. The numbers told the story before the news could. 193 UAVs detected, 12 regions targeted simultaneously. It was not just an attack, it was a statement written across the entire map of a collapsing empire. Bryansk, Tula, Kursk, Lipetsk, Moscow Oblast, each name lit up red on the defense network, like wounds on the body of a giant that didn't know where to bleed first. The swarm moved like an idea everywhere at once, impossible to contain. This was the birth of a new kind of power. The age of billion-dollar missiles and steel fortresses had ended. In its place came something leaner, faster, more ruthless, cost-effective chaos. Each drone cost less than the fuel inside the tanks that tried to intercept it. Each explosion from the sky was a line of code made flesh, a calculation that proved a devastating truth. You don't need to be stronger to win. You just need to be smarter. The Empire's defenses, built for speed and glory, had no answer for humility. Their 400 seconds could track hypersonic missiles from across continents, but they could not catch 100 tiny wings flying beneath the radar. Their Pantsir systems, designed for short-range precision, could only track a handful of targets at once before reaching their limit. And that night, the limit came fast. Screens turned red, alarms screamed, and the operators trained to expect order were drowned in noise. They fired missile after missile, each one costing more than a soldier's yearly pay, each one chasing a shadow that was already gone. It was a war of economics as much as engineering. Every time a drone fell, it took with it a fortune. Every interception was a loss disguised as a victory. For every drone worth a few $1,000s, the Empire had to fire a missile worth hundreds of thousands. The math was merciless. It wasn't just a battle, it was a bleeding of resources, a slow, elegant dismantling of wealth and pride. The planners in Kyiv had understood something profound. The Empire could not afford to fight its own fear. The more it tried to defend itself, the faster it would consume itself. By forcing the enemy to fight an army of ghosts, Ukraine had turned defense into defeat. What mattered was not how many drones were destroyed, but how many had to be fought. In the air defense centers, operators watched helplessly as their systems locked onto decoys, while real targets slipped through untouched. The swarm split, multiplied, redirected. Artificial intelligence guided them like a conductor, leading an invisible orchestra. By the time the defenders realized what was happening, the rhythm was unstoppable. The system had been flooded with too many decisions, too many threats, too much fear. And fear, once it enters a machine built by humans, corrodes it from the inside. The brilliance of the operation was its restraint. It did not seek to annihilate, it sought to exhaust. It did not try to destroy the fortress, it made the fortress destroy itself. Every missile launched from Novagrad's defenses was a confession. We are afraid. Every explosion above the rooftops was another dollar set on fire, another sign that power without purpose burns its own foundation. When the sun rose the next morning, the Empire's accountants, not its generals, felt the greatest shock. The cost of one night of defense equaled months of war spending. The balance sheet told a truth the propaganda never could. The Empire had been beaten by its own equation. For Ukraine, the victory was not only in the numbers, it was in the message. A small nation had taught the world that technology, when guided by imagination and desperation, could outthink an empire built on vanity. The swarm was not just a weapon, it was philosophy in motion. It said, "You cannot defend against evolution." And as analysts across the world studied the attack, they understood what had truly happened. The Empire's fall had not come from the outside. It had come from within, from its blind faith in the old ways, its refusal to adapt, its belief that money could buy safety and fear could buy loyalty. The drones did not just pierce the sky of Novagrad, they pierced the myth that had kept it alive. That night, the war changed forever. The world saw that intelligence could conquer might, and that even the most advanced fortress can drown in the simplest storm. The capital had survived, but its empire had not. The balance of power had shifted, and it did so not with a roar, but with a whisper of wings in the dark. The aftermath revealed everything that the night had concealed. The Empire's defense network, its pride, its symbol, its promise, had failed not because of lack of strength, but because it was built for a world that no longer existed. Viktor Orlov had created a machine designed to fight giants, yet it was undone by shadows. His billion-dollar systems, engineered to intercept missiles that screamed through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, were powerless against wings made of carbon fiber and code. The age of power had ended. The age of adaptability had begun. In the days that followed, reports poured in from every command center. Analysts traced the failure line by line, looking for a glitch, a malfunction, a single point of collapse to blame. But the truth was far crueler. There was no malfunction. The system had done exactly what it was built to do. It simply could not see the world for what it had become. The radars scanned too high. The algorithms filtered out what seemed too small. The Empire had prepared for the enemy of yesterday and ignored the invention of tomorrow. The engineers who designed the defense network had once been called visionaries. Now they were ghosts of a dying philosophy. They had built fortresses in the sky, but never imagined that the real threat would crawl beneath their vision. They had trusted hardware over imagination, speed over subtlety, authority over innovation, and in doing so, they created the perfect monument to their own blindness. The drones had proven something no strategist dared admit, that intelligence, not firepower, defines the battlefield. Every nation watching knew it. The lesson was simple and merciless. Arrogance cannot defend itself. The Empire's systems, once admired by allies and feared by enemies, were now artifacts of failure. Their beauty was mechanical,
Sir, look at
their
the green data
weakness
stream.
human.
It's adapting
They were
too
built on the
fast.
belief that the enemy would always play by the same rules. Ukraine had rewritten those rules overnight. Within the Defense Ministry, silence replaced argument. No one wanted to be the one to speak the truth out loud. The Empire's shield had never truly worked. It had only performed well enough to maintain the illusion that control could be engineered, that fear could be measured, that power could last forever. But illusions are fragile things, and once broken, they cannot be repaired. Viktor Orlov refused to hear the reports. To him, the problem was not the system, it was the people who operated it. He demanded loyalty, demanded explanations, demanded results that no one could deliver. He had built a fortress of steel, but he had never built a fortress of understanding. His army obeyed, but it no longer believed. His scientists designed, but they no longer dreamed. The war he was fighting was no longer against another nation, it was against time itself. Every failure uncovered another truth. The Empire's technology had evolved, but its thinking had not. It still lived in the past, bound by doctrines written by men who could not imagine a world where a nation's strength was measured in algorithms and not arsenals. The Empire's generals saw numbers where they should have seen ideas. They saw enemies where they should have seen evolution. And in that blindness, they lost the future. What Ukraine achieved that night was more than a tactical victory, it was a revolution of thought. A smaller, poorer, wounded nation had outmaneuvered one of the world's greatest military powers not through destruction, but through design.
Stay calm.
The drones had no faces, no flags, no fear. They represented a generation that believed innovation was its only weapon. They were the embodiment of every mind that refused to surrender. Every engineer who stayed awake under candlelight to build something that could challenge the impossible. The fall of Novagrad's defenses was not the end of an empire. It was the revelation of a truth humanity had always known, and too often forgotten. Strength without wisdom is just noise. In that silence after the explosions, the lesson was clear. The machines had done what humans could not. They evolved, they adapted, they listened. The engineers who watched the footage of the failed intercepts understood what their leader never would. The Empire had lost because it had stopped learning. The drones had won because they never stopped thinking. And that difference, tiny, invisible, immeasurable, was enough to change the course of history. From that night forward, war would no longer belong to the powerful. It would belong to the creative, the flexible, the unafraid. The kind who looked at impossibility and saw potential. The kind who knew that progress does not roar, it whispers. And its whisper is louder than any empire's pride. When the sirens began again, they no longer sounded like warnings. They sounded like the truth. For the people of Novagrad, the war had finally come home. What had once been distant, something glimpsed on news screens, wrapped in patriotic slogans, was now vibrating through their windows, echoing through their walls, shaking the certainty out of their lives. The Empire's illusion had collapsed overnight. For years, they had been told that their homeland was untouchable, that danger lived far away, that the walls of power would always protect them. But now, those walls were trembling, and the fear that had been exported for so long had returned to its source. Mothers held their children under stairwells, businessmen slept in parking garages, and the city's powerful elites watched from their glass towers as the sky above them turned hostile. The shock wasn't that the city was under attack. The shock was realizing that everything they had believed in was a lie. The Empire had promised safety in exchange for silence, pride in exchange for obedience, and for years, that trade had seemed fair. But safety was gone, pride had burned, silence had lost its value. The first lie to die was the promise of control. State television repeated that everything was fine, that the defense had prevailed, that the drones were nothing but failed attempts by desperate enemies. But the people didn't believe it anymore. They had seen the flashes, heard the explosions, felt the ground move beneath them. They didn't need permission to know what was real. For the first time in decades, the citizens of Novagrad believed their own eyes more than their government's words. The monopoly on truth had ended. The second lie to die was the illusion of distance. The Empire's leaders had always kept war at the edges of maps, far from their glittering capital. They had built a narrative where the front line was somewhere else, somewhere poor, expendable, unseen. Now that front line had arrived at their doorstep. Air raid sirens replaced music in the plazas. The same people who had once watched the suffering of others with indifference were now tasting its silence firsthand. The distance between propaganda and reality had vanished, and with it, the arrogance of those who thought themselves untouchable. Viktor Orlov appeared on national television the next morning, his voice strained, his words mechanical. He spoke of strength, of resilience, of national pride. But the tremor in his tone betrayed him. He no longer sounded like a leader. He sounded like a man begging his own myth to survive another day. And while his words echoed through the broadcast, the people watched with hollow eyes, not in hatred, but in understanding. They finally saw him for what he was: not a savior, not a titan, but a man afraid of losing the power that had once made him feel immortal. Across the city, whispers began to spread. In crowded cafes, in cold subway stations, in dim apartments, people talked in low voices about the night the sky fell. They talked about the fear in the soldiers' faces, the explosions they were told never happened, the silence that followed every promise. They no longer feared speaking. When fear becomes universal, it loses its power to divide. The people began to share not just stories but truth. Even the elites felt the shift. The fortress they had helped build, the regime they had fed and profited from, had turned into a cage. Their gated communities, once symbols of privilege, now felt like prisons under an enemy sky. Their private jets sat grounded at the same airports they once used to escape reality. And for the first time, they realized that wealth could not buy air. It could not stop panic. It could not command calm. The sound of sirens leveled them all. Among the younger generation, something else began to awaken. They had grown up in the Empire's shadow, taught to obey, to repeat, to forget. But this night, this endless chorus of alarms and fire had shown them that the truth could no longer be buried. They saw what their parents had chosen not to see, that strength without humanity is hollow, and that loyalty to fear is the slowest kind of death. The propaganda machine that once shaped their world now spun out of control, outpaced by the simple power of shared memory. By dawn, the panic had quieted, but not the awakening. The streets were still, yet beneath that stillness something irreversible had begun. The people no longer looked at their government with faith, but with recognition. They understood the nature of the empire they had built their lives under. They understood that the fortress meant not safety, but submission. And in that understanding lay the first spark of freedom. The war outside the walls had triggered another within the war between belief and truth, obedience and awareness, comfort and courage. The people of Novagrad could no longer go back to not knowing. Once the sirens entered their hearts, they could never leave. The fear that had been their master had now become their teacher. And in that fear, a new kind of strength was. When the echoes of that night finally faded, nothing in Novagrad was the same. The smoke cleared, the fires dimmed, but the silence that followed was louder than any explosion. The war had not ended, it had transformed. What began as a battle for airspace had become something far greater, something deeper. It was no longer a war between nations. It was a war between illusion and reality, between a regime built on fear and a truth that refused to die. Viktor Orlov stood at the center of his masterpiece, the fortress he had built out of paranoia, money, and pride. It had been his greatest monument, his legacy of control. Yet now, it stood as his confession. The more tightly he had tried to protect it, the faster it had unraveled. The empire he ruled no longer feared its enemies, it feared itself. The walls he raised to keep chaos out had only trapped it inside. For years, he had believed that power was protection, that if he surrounded himself with enough steel, enough missiles, enough silence, he could outlive every threat. But power built on fear has only one enemy, truth. And the truth had come, not as a missile, not as an army, but as the whisper of machines in the night. It did not aim for destruction, it aimed for revelation. It showed the world that even the mightiest can fall not through force, but through blindness. Outside the walls of the Kremlin, life went on, but differently. The people of Novagrad no longer looked to the sky with awe or pride. They looked with awareness. They had seen how easily strength could turn into weakness, how easily trust could be betrayed, how quickly safety could become a lie. The myth of the untouchable capital had died, and in its place, something new began to live, a quiet, unspoken unity, born from shared fear and awakening. Across the empire, people began to question not just their leaders, but themselves. They asked how many years had been lost to silence, how many truths had been buried under the weight of obedience, how many minds had been told not to think. For the first time, the people did not wait for permission to wonder. The attack had done what no revolution could. It had forced them to see. Even those who once held power began to understand the cost of their loyalty. The generals who once saluted with pride now looked at their medals and saw only the price of submission. The bureaucrats who had enforced silence now whispered truth behind closed doors. Fear, The Empire's oldest weapon had turned against its master. The same fear that had kept people obedient was now the fire that pushed them to change. The drones that pierced Novagrad's defenses had done more than damage steel.
We have to move now.
They had pierced the illusion that control is strength. They had proven that the future belongs not to those who command, but to those who create, to those who dare to think beyond fear. The Empire's fortress had fallen, but from its ruins rose a lesson too powerful to be silenced. No wall can protect a lie forever. For Viktor Orlov, the end came quietly. There was no coup, no final speech, no defiant gesture. History rarely grants tyrants the closure they expect. His downfall was not written in the language of revolution, but in the language of irrelevance. The people stopped listening, the world stopped fearing. His fortress became a museum of failure, a monument to the cost of refusing to evolve. But the story did not end with him. It began with those who refused to let fear define them. The engineers who built the drones, the civilians who shared the truth, the soldiers who chose not to fire. They became the quiet architects of a new age. They had proven that courage does not always roar.
There's nothing left.
Sometimes it hums, sometimes it flies. Sometimes it comes in the form of small, persistent voices that will not be silenced. The fall of Fortress Novagrad became a symbol for generations, a reminder that empires do not die when they are conquered. They die when they stop listening, when they forget what it means to serve something greater than power itself. The drones were not the enemy, they were the mirror. And in that mirror, humanity saw its reflection, not the perfection it pretended to be, but the imperfection it needed to embrace. Because in the end, this was never just about war, it was about awakening. It was about a people remembering that freedom is not built from steel, but from understanding. That safety is not found in silence, but in truth. That fear may build walls, but courage breaks them down. And as the sun rose over the city that had once called itself eternal, the world saw what Viktor Orlov could not. The empire had fallen, but humanity had risen. The fortress was gone.
Wait a minute.
But in its place stood something stronger, the unshakable knowledge that even in the darkest night, truth always finds its way through the cracks. In the end, the story of Fortress Novagrad is not just about war, or technology, or politics. It is about us, about the fragile line between power and fear, truth and illusion, control and chaos. It reminds us that no matter how high we build our walls, no matter how loud our leaders speak, there will always come a moment when reality knocks on the gates we thought were unbreakable. And when it does, the true measure of strength is not how tightly we hold on, but how bravely we learn to let go. Viktor Orlov's empire fell not because it lacked weapons, but because it lacked wisdom. It collapsed under the weight of its own blindness, its refusal to listen, its obsession with control. The same lesson echoes across every corner of history. Fear can build empires, but only truth can sustain them. And when truth finally arrives, it doesn't come with noise, it comes with clarity. So maybe the question isn't how to build stronger walls, but how to build better hearts. How to replace fear with understanding, and silence with courage. Because in every fortress we build, whether of power, pride, or ego, there will come a day when we must face what lies beyond the gate. If this story moved you, let it remind you that courage begins where fear ends. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that reveal not just the wars we fight in the world, but the wars we fight within ourselves. Because the greatest battles are not always waged on battlefields, they are fought in the human soul.